The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Clara Hawthorne stepped off the stagecoach, her boots sinking into the muddy street of Willow Creek. It was 1853 and the Wyoming Territory stretched before her like a promise whispered in a dream, rugged mountains kissed by golden sunlight, rivers glinting like threads of silver. She clutched her worn leather satchel, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. At 28, Clara had left behind a life of whispers and judgment in Boston, chasing a letter from a man she'd never met, a man who'd promised her a future. But as she scanned the dusty faces of the townsfolk, her stomach twisted. Where was he? Clara wasn't what most would call beautiful, not in the way society demanded. Her auburn hair curled wildly, refusing to be tamed by pins, and her freckled face bore the marks of a childhood spent under the sun rather than in parlors. She was sturdy with calloused hands from years of seamstress work, and her plain gray dress did little to hide her broad shoulders. In Boston, men had called her unladylike, her father's debts branding her as undesirable. But Thomas Whitaker, a rancher in Willow Creek, had written of a life built on mutual respect, not appearances. His letters had been kind, steady like the rhythm of a heartbeat. She'd believed him. The townsfolk stared as she stood alone, their murmurs sharp as thorns. "That's the mail-order bride," a woman whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. Clara's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. She'd faced worse. Then a man approached, tall with a neatly trimmed beard and cold blue eyes. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitaker, but his gaze swept over her with disappointment. "You're not what I expected," he said flatly, his words slicing through her. "I thought you'd be different." Clara's throat tightened. "You mean prettier?" she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Thomas didn't deny it. He muttered something about needing a wife who could fit in with Willow Creek's expectations, then turned away, leaving her standing in the street. The rejection stung like a slap, but Clara refused to crumble. She'd come too far. She'd find a way to survive. As the stagecoach rattled away, a woman approached, small, with warm brown eyes and a flour-dusted apron. "I'm Eliza, the baker's wife," she said, offering a kind smile. "You look like you could use a friend." Clara nodded, grateful but wary. Eliza led her to a small boarding house where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the tang of wood smoke. Over a cup of weak coffee, Eliza listened as Clara poured out her story, not just Thomas's rejection, but the years of being deemed less than because of her looks, her independence, her father's ruin. "This town's full of folks who judge too quick," Eliza said, squeezing her hand. "But not everyone. You'll see." That evening, Clara sat by her window watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. She felt the weight of her solitude, but also a flicker of defiance. She hadn't come to Willow Creek for Thomas Whitaker. She'd come for herself, for a chance to build something new. As she unpacked her satchel, her fingers brushed against the letter she'd kept not from Thomas, but from her late mother, urging her to be brave. She whispered to herself, "I am enough." A knock at the door startled her. Eliza stood there, her eyes bright. "There's someone you should meet tomorrow," she said. "A man who doesn't care for fancy looks or fancy talk. He's got a ranch just outside town, and he's been alone too long." Clara's heart skipped, but doubt crept in. Could she trust another man after today? As Eliza left, the question hung in the air, heavy as the Wyoming dusk. The morning sun spilled over Willow Creek, like honey casting long shadows across the valley, as Clara stepped onto the boarding house porch. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of dew-soaked grass and distant campfire smoke. She smoothed her faded blue dress, her nerves humming like a plucked guitar string. Eliza's words from last night echoed in her mind, a man, a rancher, someone who might see her for who she was. But after Thomas's rejection, Clara's heart felt like a locked door, and she wasn't sure she had the key. Eliza arrived, her cheeks flushed from the morning's baking. "Come on," she said, looping her arm through Clara's. "Jacob Harlan's not one for town gossip, but he's worth meeting." They walked past the general store, where women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting toward Clara. She kept her gaze forward, focusing on the crunch of gravel under her boots and the distant call of a meadowlark. Willow Creek was small, its wooden buildings weathered by wind and time, but the surrounding mountains stood tall, their peaks dusted with early snow. The beauty of the land felt like a quiet promise, one she wasn't ready to trust. They reached Harlan's ranch by noon, a sprawling spread of golden fields and grazing cattle bordered by a winding river that sparkled under the sunlight. The house was sturdy but modest, its logs worn smooth by years of Wyoming winters. Jacob Harlan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was broad-shouldered with dark hair curling under a weathered hat, and eyes the color of storm clouds, steady but carrying a shadow of something unspoken. Eliza, he greeted, his voice low and warm, then turned to Clara. "You must be Miss Hawthorne." Clara nodded, her throat dry. His gaze didn't linger on her freckles or her plain dress, but met her eyes with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Just Clara," she said, forcing a smile. Jacob gestured toward the porch, where a pitcher of water and tin cups waited. As they sat, Eliza chattered about the town's harvest festival, but Clara felt Jacob's attention on her, not judging, but curious, like he was reading a book no one else had bothered to open. "Eliza says you're new to Willow Creek," Jacob said, his voice gentle but direct. "What brought you here?" Clara hesitated, the sting of Thomas's rejection still fresh. She could lie, spin a tale of adventure, but something in Jacob's steady gaze urged honesty. "I came for a marriage that didn't happen," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man, he didn't want me." She braced for pity, but Jacob's expression didn't waver. "His loss," he said simply, and the words landed like a soft touch, unexpected and warm. They talked for hours about the ranch, the town, the way the river sang at night. Jacob spoke of losing his brother to fever 2 years ago, leaving him to run the ranch alone. His words carried a weight Clara recognized, the kind carved by grief and resilience. She found herself sharing pieces of her own past, her mother's death, her father's debts, the Boston suitors who'd scoffed at her calloused hands. Jacob listened, not interrupting his silence, a kind of respect she wasn't used to. As the sun dipped low, painting the fields in shades of amber, a horse's hoofbeats broke the moment. A woman rode up, her auburn curls pinned elegantly her dress, a rich green that screamed wealth. "Jacob," she called, her voice sharp and familiar. "I didn't know you had company," Eliza whispered to Clara. "That's Margaret Tate, Thomas's sister. She and Jacob were close once." Margaret's eyes narrowed as they landed on Clara, her smile tight. "You're the new girl, aren't you? The one Thomas sent packing." Clara's spine stiffened, but before she could respond, Jacob stood, his tone calm but firm. "Clara's my guest, Margaret. She's welcome here." The air crackled with tension, and Clara felt the weight of Margaret's disdain, a mirror of the judgment she'd fled in Boston. As Margaret rode off, her parting glance promised trouble. Jacob turned to Clara, his expression soft but serious. "You don't owe her or anyone an explanation. Stay for supper." Clara's heart wavered, caught between fear of another rejection and the warmth in Jacob's voice. As the stars began to prick the twilight sky, she wondered if Willow Creek might hold more than broken promises. The fire in Jacob Harlan's hearth crackled, casting a warm glow across the simple dining room as Clara sat across from him, the scent of roasted venison and fresh cornbread filling the air. Outside, the Wyoming night hummed with the chorus of crickets and the soft rush of the river, but inside a quiet tension lingered. Clara's hands fidgeted with her fork, Margaret Tate's sharp words still echoing in her mind. The one Thomas sent packing. She wanted to believe Jacob's kindness, his steady gaze that seemed to see her without judgment, but doubt gnawed at her. Could she trust this moment, or was it another fragile hope destined to shatter? Jacob passed her a plate, his calloused fingers brushing hers briefly, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "You're quiet," he said, not pushing, just observing. His voice was like the river outside, calm but deep, carrying currents she couldn't quite read. Clara forced a smile, her mother's words whispering in her memory. "Be brave, Clara, even when it hurts." "Just thinking about today," she said. "It's been a lot." He nodded, leaning back in his chair, the firelight catching the faint scar above his brow. "Willow Creek can be hard on newcomers," he said. "Folks here hold tight to their ways, but they come around if you give them time." His eyes held hers, steady and kind, but Clara wondered if he meant it, or if he too would eventually see her as less than. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the cornbread, its warmth grounding her. As they ate, Jacob spoke of the ranch, how the land had been his father's dream, how he'd fought to keep it after his brother's death. His voice softened when he mentioned his brother, a man who'd love to carve wooden figures and laugh at the smallest things. I miss him, Jacob admitted, staring into the fire. Feels like I'm carrying his dreams along with mine. Clara understood that weight, the way loss could shape you into something stronger but heavier. She shared a memory of her mother, how she taught Clara to sew by candlelight, stitching hope into every seam. For a moment, the room felt like a sanctuary, their shared stories weaving a fragile thread between them. But the moment broke when a sharp knock rattled the door. Jacob frowned, rising to answer it. Thomas Whitaker stood there, his hat in hand, his face a mix of irritation and unease. "Harlan," he said, barely glancing at Clara. "We need to talk. About the water rights. You know Margaret's been stirring up the town council." Clara's stomach sank. Thomas's presence felt like a cold wind, dragging her back to the sting of his rejection. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Not tonight, Whitaker. I've got company." Thomas's eyes flicked to Clara, narrowing. "You're wasting your time, Harlan. She's not worth it." The words hit like a stone, and Clara's hands clenched under the table. Before she could speak, Jacob stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You don't get to decide who's worth my time, Thomas. Go home." Thomas hesitated, then turned away, muttering under his breath as he disappeared into the night. Jacob closed the door, his expression unreadable as he returned to the table. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer now. "He's got no right to talk like that." Clara nodded, but the words lingered, feeding her doubts. Was she foolish to hope for a place here for someone like Jacob, who seemed to see her differently? She wanted to ask him why he'd defended her, but fear held her back. Instead, she said, "Thank you for standing up for me." He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. "You don't need defending, Clara, but I'll do it anyway." The words warmed her, but as she left the ranch under a sky blazing with stars, Margaret's glare and Thomas's scorn replayed in her mind. She felt the weight of Willow Creek's judgment, a town that seemed determined to keep her an outsider. Yet Jacob's kindness lingered, a spark in the dark. As she walked back to the boarding house, the river's song followed her, and she wondered if she could find the courage to stay and fight for a place in this unforgiving land. The dawn broke over Willow Creek with a blush of pink and gold, the mountains standing like silent sentinels. As Clara stood at the boarding house window, her breath fogging the glass. She hadn't slept well, her dreams tangled with Thomas's cold words and the warmth of Jacob's gray eyes. Could a man like him truly see her, not as a disappointment, but as an equal? The thought felt like a fragile thread, one she was afraid to pull too hard. Today she'd decided she wouldn't hide. She'd face the town, its whispers and her own doubts head on. Eliza had invited her to help at the bakery, a small act of kindness that felt like a lifeline. Clara pulled on her shawl, the scent of pine and morning dew greeting her as she stepped into the street. The town was waking its rhythm, marked by the clatter of wagon wheels and the laughter of children chasing a stray dog. But as Clara passed the general store, the whispers began. "That's the girl Thomas rejected," a woman muttered, her voice sharp as a needle. "Too plain for a man like him." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, her boots steady against the dirt. She'd heard worse in Boston. She could endure this. At the bakery, the air was thick with the sweet warmth of rising dough and cinnamon. Eliza handed Clara an apron, her smile a quiet encouragement. "Don't mind the gossip," she said, kneading a mound of dough. "Folks here cling to stories like they're scripture. Give 'em a new one to tell." Clara nodded, rolling up her sleeves. As she shaped loaves, her hands found a rhythm, the work grounding her. She wasn't just a rejected bride, she was Clara Hawthorne, who'd sewn dresses through sleepless nights, who'd carried her family's shame without breaking. She could build something here, too. Mid-morning, the bakery door swung open, and Margaret Tate swept in her green silk dress, catching the light like a peacock's tail. Her smile was all teeth, her eyes fixed on Clara. "So you're still here," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I thought you'd be on the next stagecoach by now." Clara's hands stilled on the dough, her pulse quickening. Eliza stepped forward, but Clara shook her head slightly. She wouldn't hide behind anyone. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Willow Creek's my home now." Margaret's laugh was sharp like breaking glass. "Home. You think you belong here? A woman like you, with no name, no beauty, no prospects." The words cut deep, but Clara met her gaze, refusing to flinch. "I belong anywhere I choose to stay," she said. Margaret's smile faltered, but before she could retort, the door opened again. Jacob Harlan stepped inside his presence, filling the small space like a warm wind. His eyes flicked from Margaret to Clara, reading the tension in an instant. "Morning, Eliza," he said, nodding, then turned to Clara. "I was hoping you'd have time to walk with me later. There's something I'd like to show you at the ranch." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet challenge in the way he ignored Margaret. Clara's heart stuttered, caught between surprise and a flicker of hope. I'd like that she said, her voice softer than she intended. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, sweeping out of the bakery with a huff. As the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake Margaret's words or the weight of the town's stares. But Jacob's invitation lingered, a small light in the fog of doubt. When the bakery closed, she met him by the river, where the water shimmered under the afternoon sun, carrying the scent of wet stone and wildflowers. He led her to a grove of aspens, their leaves trembling like golden coins in the breeze. "This is my favorite place," he said, his voice low. "When things get heavy, I come here to think." Clara felt the truth in his words, the way the land seemed to hold its own kind of peace. He turned to her, his expression earnest. "I know this town's not easy, Clara, but you've got more strength than they give you credit for." "I see it." His words were a balm, but before she could respond, hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Thomas Whitaker rode toward them, his face dark with purpose. "Harlan," he called, his voice sharp, "we need to settle this water rights business now. And he jabbed a finger at Clara, doesn't belong in it." Clara's heart pounded, but Jacob stepped closer to her, his presence a shield. What would happen next? The river's song turned fierce as Thomas Whitaker's horse snorted its hooves, kicking up dust that swirled in the late afternoon light. Clara stood rooted beside Jacob, the aspens trembling around them, like a crowd holding its breath. Thomas's finger still pointed at her, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "She doesn't belong." Her chest tightened, the old wounds of rejection splitting open, but she clenched her fists, her mother's voice echoing. "Be brave, Clara." She wasn't the girl who'd cowered in Boston. She wouldn't cower now. Jacob's shoulder brushed hers, a steady warmth against the chill of Thomas's glare. "This isn't about Clara." Jacob said, his voice low but unyielding, like the deep rumble of the river. "You want to talk water rights, Thomas, fine, but leave her out of it." His gray eyes held Thomas's unflinching, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, something that made her heart ache in a way she wasn't ready to name. Thomas dismounted, his boots thudding against the earth. "You're making a fool of yourself, Harlan," he sneered, his gaze flicking to Clara with disdain. "She's nothing, a nobody who thought she could waltz into Willow Creek and play wife. You're better than that." The words stung, each one a needle pricking at the confidence Clara had been stitching together. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the aspens, but Jacob's presence anchored her. She took a breath, the scent of river water and pine grounding her. "I'm not playing at anything," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I came here to build a life same as anyone. You don't get to decide who I am." Thomas's eyes widened, as if he hadn't expected her to speak. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the rush of the river and the rustle of leaves. Jacob's lips twitched, a flicker of pride crossing his face, and Clara felt a spark of courage ignite within her. Thomas recovered, his laugh sharp and hollow. "You're wasting your time, Harlan. She'll drag you down just like her kind always does." He stepped closer, his posture aggressive, but Jacob moved between them, his broad frame a quiet wall. "Enough," Jacob said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You've said your piece. Now get off my land." Thomas hesitated, his jaw tight, then mounted his horse and rode off, the dust trailing behind him like a fading threat. Clara exhaled, her knees trembling as the tension drained from her body. Jacob turned to her, his expression softening. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now, like the breeze through the aspens. She nodded, though her heart still raced. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he added, his eyes searching hers. "Thomas, he's got a way of tearing people down to feel bigger. Don't let him." "I'm trying not to," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked out at the river, its surface catching the last rays of sunlight, and felt the weight of her past pressing against her. "It's just, I've heard those words before. In Boston, they said I wasn't enough, Not pretty, not proper, not worthy. I thought it'd be different here. Her voice cracked and she hated the vulnerability in it, but Jacob didn't look away. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. "You're more than enough, Clara," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You stood up to him just now. That's not nothing, it's everything." His words wrapped around her like a warm shawl, and for the first time in days she felt seen, not as a rejected bride, but as herself. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to this moment, but doubt lingered like a shadow. As they walked back toward the ranch, the sky deepening to a velvet blue, Jacob pointed out the stars beginning to emerge. "My brother used to say the stars were stories waiting to be told," he said, his voice soft. "Maybe you're writing a new one here." Clara smiled, the idea sparking something hopeful in her chest. But as they reached the ranch gate, a figure stood in the distance. Margaret Tate watching from the shadows, her expression unreadable. Clara's stomach twisted. What was Margaret planning, and how far would she go to keep Clara out of Willow Creek? The lantern's glow flickered across the boarding house room, casting soft shadows on the walls as Clara sat at the small wooden desk, her fingers tracing the edges of her mother's old letters. The paper was worn, the ink faded, but the words still carried her mother's strength. "You are enough, Clara, no matter what the world says." Outside, Willow Creek slept under a blanket of stars, the distant howl of a coyote mingling with the river's gentle murmur. But Clara's mind was restless, caught between Jacob's quiet kindness and Margaret's watchful eyes. She felt like a seed planted in rocky soil, determined to grow, but unsure if the ground would yield. Morning brought a bustle to the town as preparations for the harvest festival began. Clara joined Eliza at the bakery, where the air was thick with the scent of apple pies and molasses cookies. The work steadied her hands kneading dough with a rhythm that felt like defiance. Eliza hummed as she worked her warmth, a contrast to the whispers that followed Clara through town. "You're doing fine," Eliza said, catching Clara's eye. "Folks'll come around once they see your heart." Clara wanted to believe her, but Margaret's shadow loomed, and Thomas's words still stung like salt in a wound. By afternoon, the town square was alive with color. Burlap banners strung between lamppost tables, laden with pumpkins and jars of preserves. Clara helped Eliza set up a booth, her plain dress dusted with flour, her auburn curls escaping their pins. She felt the townsfolk's eyes on her, some curious, others cold. Then Jacob appeared, carrying a crate of apples from his ranch, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms dusted with earth. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting the crate down with a grin that made Clara's chest tighten. His presence was like the first warm day after winter, quietly transformative. They worked side by side, arranging apples and pies, their conversation easy despite the crowd. Jacob told her about the festival's history, how it marked the town's survival through harsh winters. "It's a time for second chances," he said, his eyes holding hers a moment too long. Clara's heart fluttered, but doubt crept in. Could she trust this feeling, or was it another illusion? Like Thomas's letters, before she could dwell. Margaret approached, her silk dress a stark contrast to the homespun crowd. "Jacob," she called, her voice honeyed but sharp. "I need your help with the auction table. Surely you can spare a moment." Jacob hesitated, glancing at Clara. "I'm helping here," he said evenly. Margaret's smile tightened, her gaze flicking to Clara like a blade. "Of course," she said, her tone icy. "I wouldn't want to interrupt, whatever this is." She turned away, but not before Clara caught the glint of calculation in her eyes. Margaret wasn't just a scorned ex. She was a woman used to getting her way, and Clara was in her path. As the festival began, music filled the air, a fiddle's lively tune weaving through laughter and chatter. Jacob stayed close, his quiet humor easing Clara's nerves. He pointed out townsfolk sharing stories that made her laugh, a rare, unguarded sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. But the moment shattered when Margaret took the stage for the auction, her voice commanding attention. "And now a special item," she announced, holding up a quilt Clara had seen in the bakery, one she'd helped Eliza finish. "Donated by our newest resident, Clara Hawthorne." Margaret said, her smile sharp. "Though I'm sure it's modest like its maker." The crowd tittered and Clara's face burned. She'd poured hours into that quilt, stitching her hopes into every seam. Margaret's words turned it into a joke. Clara wanted to flee, but Jacob's hand brushed her arm, grounding her. "She's wrong. he whispered, his voice fierce. That quilt's beautiful. You're beautiful. The words stole her breath, but before she could respond, a shout rang out. Thomas, storming toward the stage, his face red with anger. This auction's a farce, he bellowed, pointing at Clara. She's got no place here, and you all know it. The crowd hushed, eyes darting between Thomas, Clara, and Jacob, who stepped forward, his fists clenched. What would happen when the town's judgment collided with Clara's resolve? The fiddle's tune faltered as Thomas's voice cut through the festival's hum, sharp and venomous, his finger jabbing toward Clara like an accusation. The Willow Creek square felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of crushed grass and cider, the crowd's eyes pinning her like a butterfly to a board. Clara's heart pounded each beat, a reminder of every rejection she'd endured. Boston's sneers, Thomas's dismissal, Margaret's calculated barbs. But as she stood beside Jacob, the warmth of his presence like a steady hand at her back, she felt something shift inside her. She was done being silent. Jacob stepped forward, his broad frame shielding her from Thomas's glare. That's enough, Whitaker, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a storm. You don't speak for this town. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others, whispering, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Clara's hands trembled, but she straightened, her mother's words ringing clear. Be brave, Clara. She stepped beside Jacob, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. I didn't come here to be your punching bag, Thomas, she said loud enough for the crowd to hear. I came to build a life. If you can't handle that, it's your problem, not mine. A hush fell, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Thomas's face reddened, his mouth opening to retort, but Eliza pushed through the crowd, her apron still dusted with flour. Clara's right, she declared, her voice firm. She's worked hard, helped me at the bakery, made that quilt you're all bidding on. She's one of us, whether you like it or not. A few townsfolk clapped, others shifted uncomfortably, but Clara felt a spark of hope. Maybe not everyone in Willow Creek saw her as an outsider. Margaret, still on the stage, clutched the quilt, her smile gone. Let's move on, she said tightly, raising the gavel to start the bidding. But Jacob raised his hand. I'll start at $10, he called, his voice clear. The crowd gasped. $10 was a fortune for a quilt. Clara's eyes widened, meeting his, and she saw something there. Not pity, but respect, maybe even something deeper. Margaret's gavel hesitated, her eyes narrowing, but the bids climbed, spurred by Jacob's lead. The quilt sold for $20, a sum that left the crowd buzzing and Clara's heart soaring. It wasn't just about the money, it was proof her work had value, that she had value. As the auction ended, Jacob pulled Clara aside near a table laden with lanterns that flickered like fireflies. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice soft, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. I wanted to. That quilt's worth every cent, and so are you. His words were simple, but they landed like a stone in the still water, rippling through her doubts. For the first time, she let herself imagine a future where someone saw her fully, not as a disappointment, but as a partner. But the night wasn't done with its challenges. As the festival continued, Margaret approached, her green dress catching the lantern, light like a warning. You think you've won them over, she said, her voice low, meant for Clara alone. Jacob's just being kind. He'll see you for what you are soon enough. The words were a knife twisting in Clara's insecurities. She wanted to snap back, but Margaret was already gone, melting into the crowd. Clara's resolve wavered, the old fears creeping in. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe Jacob's kindness was just pity. As the music swelled and couples began to dance, Jacob extended his hand. Dance with me, he asked, his gray eyes warm in the lantern glow. Clara hesitated, her heart caught between fear and longing. She glanced at the crowd, at Margaret's distant smirk, then back at Jacob. His hand was steady, an invitation to trust, to step into the light. She took it, her fingers curling around his, the warmth of his touch chasing away the chill of doubt. As they moved to the fiddle's tune, the world blurred, leaving only the rhythm of their steps and the spark of something new between them. But as the song ended, a shout rang out from the edge of the square. A fire, someone cried at the bakery. Clara's heart stopped. Was this an accident, or had Margaret's resentment turned dangerous? The shout of fire sliced through the festival's joy like a blade jerking Clara's gaze from Jacob's steady hand to the orange glow flickering on the horizon. Her heart lurched the bakery, Eliza's lifeline, the place where she'd found a flicker of belonging in Willow Creek. The crowd's laughter dissolved into chaos, boots pounding against the dirt as people rushed toward the blaze. Clara's feet moved before her mind caught up her skirts, brushing the grass, the scent of smoke already sharp in the air. Jacob ran beside her, his face set with determination, and for a moment their shared purpose felt like a tether stronger than any doubt. The bakery stood at the edge of the square flames, licking its wooden walls, the air thick with the acrid bite of burning timber and the sweetness of charred sugar. Eliza stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears glinting in the firelight. "My livelihood," she whispered as Clara reached her side. Townsfolk scrambled, forming a bucket line from the nearby well, their shouts mingling with the crackle of the flames. Clara grabbed a bucket, her arms straining as she passed water to Jacob, who worked with a quiet intensity, his shirt soaked with sweat and soot. As they fought the fire, Clara's eyes caught a figure in the shadows, Margaret standing apart from the crowd, her face unreadable in the flickering light. A chill ran through Clara, sharper than the night air. Was this her doing a cruel strike to punish Clara's defiance? The thought twisted in her gut, but there was no time to dwell. The fire was spreading, threatening to leap to the neighboring buildings. Clara pushed forward, her hands blistered from the bucket's handle, her resolve burning brighter than the flames. She wouldn't let Eliza lose everything, not when she'd given Clara a chance. Hours later, the fire was subdued, leaving the bakery's front charred, but standing its heart intact. The crowd dispersed, exhausted, their faces smudged with ash. Eliza hugged Clara tightly, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to stay, but you did. Thank you." Clara's throat tightened, the weight of Eliza's gratitude anchoring her to this town in a way she hadn't expected. Jacob stood nearby, wiping soot from his face, his gray eyes catching hers with a look that made her pulse quicken. Not pity, but pride. As the crowd thinned, Clara noticed Margaret lingering, her silk dress untouched by the chaos. She approached, her voice low and venomous. "You think you're a hero now. This town will never be yours." Clara's hands clenched, but before she could respond, Jacob stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Margaret, go home. This isn't your fight." Margaret's eyes flashed, but she turned away, her departure, leaving a bitter aftertaste in the air. Clara's doubts stirred, Margaret's words echoed her deepest fears that she'd never truly belong. Jacob walked Clara back to the boarding house, the night now quiet, the stars bright against the smoke-hazed sky. "You were incredible tonight," he said, his voice soft like the rustle of aspen leaves. "You didn't just save the bakery, you showed this town who you are." Clara's chest ached, torn between the warmth of his words and the fear that they were fleeting. "I'm not sure who that is yet," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep waiting for the moment someone decides I'm not enough." He stopped, turning to face her, his expression earnest in the moonlight. "Clara, I see you. Not what Thomas or Margaret or anyone else says you should be. You." His words were a spark igniting something brave and reckless in her. She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into the possibility of his regard, but the fire's aftermath and Margaret's threat lingered like smoke. As they reached the boarding house, Jacob hesitated, then took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Come to the ranch tomorrow," he said. "There's something I want to show you, something that might help you see yourself the way I do." Clara nodded, her heart caught between hope and fear. As she climbed the stairs to her room, the scent of smoke still clinging to her dress, she felt the weight of the night's events. The fire had tested her, but it had also shown her strength and Jacob's unwavering support. Yet Margaret's shadow loomed, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. What would she find at Jacob's ranch, and could it truly change how she saw herself? The morning sun rose over Willow Creek, painting the valley in soft pinks and golds, the air sharp with the scent of frost and pine. Clara stood at the edge of Jacob's ranch, her breath visible in the chill, her heart a tangle of hope and uncertainty. The fire at the bakery had left her shaken but resolute, and Jacob's invitation, something that might help you see yourself the way I do, echoed in her mind like a melody she wasn't sure she could trust. She smoothed her worn shawl, the one her mother had stitched, and stepped forward. The crunch of gravel under her boots, a small act of courage. Jacob met her at the gate, his gray eyes warm against the cool morning light, his hat tilted back to reveal the faint scar above his brow. "You came," he said, a smile softening his rugged features. "I wasn't sure you would." Clara managed a small laugh, though her nerves hummed. "I'm here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He led her past the barn where cattle lowed softly and toward a small clearing near the river where the aspens stood like golden sentinels, their leaves whispering in the breeze. He stopped at a wooden bench, weathered but sturdy, overlooking the river's gentle curve. "My brother made this," Jacob said, his voice low, carrying the weight of memory. "He used to sit here carving, dreaming. After he died, I couldn't come here for a long time. It hurt too much." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But you make me want to sit here again, Clara, to build something new." His words landed softly like leaves on the water, and Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but Margaret's venom and Thomas's rejection still lingered sharp as thorns. He gestured to a patch of earth nearby, where a small garden was taking shape, rows of turned soil, a few green shoots defying the early frost. "I started this last spring," he said. "Thought it might honor my brother, keep his dreams alive. But it's hard work alone. I could use a partner or someone with strong hands and a stronger heart." His gaze held hers steady and unguarded, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her, chasing away the chill of doubt. Was he asking for more than help with a garden? Before she could respond, hoofbeats broke the quiet. Thomas Whitaker rode up, his face tight with anger. Margaret at his side, her green dress stark against the autumn landscape. Harlan Thomas barked, dismounting. "You're stirring up trouble keeping her around." He jerked his head toward Clara, his eyes cold. "The town's talking, saying you're choosing her over what's right for Willow Creek." Margaret smirked, her voice smooth as poison. "She's a distraction, Jacob. You deserve better." Clara's heart pounded, the old fears rising. Not enough, never enough. But Jacob stepped closer to her, his voice calm but unyielding. "Clara's not a distraction. She's the best thing I've found in this town." His words were a shield, and Clara felt her spine straighten. She faced Thomas and Margaret, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she said. "I'm here to build a life same as anyone. If you can't accept that, it's your loss." Thomas scoffed, but Margaret's eyes narrowed, her silence more dangerous than words. Jacob took Clara's hand, his grip firm and warm. "This is my land," he said, "and Clara's welcome here. Always." Thomas muttered something under his breath, but he and Margaret rode off, their departure, leaving a tense quiet in its wake. Clara exhaled, her breath shaky, but Jacob's hand steadied her. "You meant that?" she asked, her voice soft, searching his face. Every word he said, his eyes holding hers like a promise. He led her to the bench, and they sat, the river's song weaving around them. "I've been alone too long, Clara," he admitted. "But with you, I feel like I'm starting to live again." His honesty cracked something open in her, and for the first time she let herself imagine a future here, not just surviving, but thriving with him. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the valley in light, Clara felt a seed of hope take root. But Margaret's parting glance lingered in her mind, a warning of trouble yet to come. The autumn wind swept through Willow Creek, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. As Clara stood in the town square, her hands clasped tightly in her shawl. The harvest festival's remnants were gone, replaced by the quiet bustle of a town rebuilding after the bakery fire. But today the air held a different charge. A meeting had been called at the church to settle the water rights dispute that Thomas and Margaret had used to fuel their campaign against Clara. Her heart thrummed with nerves, but Jacob's words from the ranch echoed in her mind. "You're the best thing I've found in this town." She held on to them like a lifeline, determined to face whatever came. The church was packed, the pews filled with townsfolk, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Clara sat near the front, Eliza at her side, her warm presence a steadying force. Jacob stood by the pulpit, his broad shoulders squared, his gray eyes calm but resolute as he addressed the crowd. "The river belongs to all of us," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of the mountains. "But Thomas Whitaker wants to divert it for his own gain, leaving smaller ranches dry. We need a fair solution, one that keeps Willow Creek whole." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding, others glancing at Thomas, who sat with Margaret, his jaw tight. Clara felt the weight of their stares, the whispers that had followed her since her arrival. The rejected bride, the outsider. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She stood, her voice clear despite the knot in her chest. "I know I'm new here," she began, her words ringing in the quiet church. "But I've seen what this town can be. Neighbors helping neighbors, like when we saved the bakery. If we let greed divide us, we lose that. I believe in Willow Creek, and I'm asking you to believe in it too." Her voice trembled at the end, but she held her head high, her mother's courage pulsing through her. A hush followed, then Eliza stood clapping loudly. "She's right," she declared, and a few others joined their applause, tentative but growing. Thomas shot to his feet, his face red. "She doesn't belong here," he shouted. "She's stirring trouble, turning you against your own." Margaret nodded, her smile sharp, but before she could speak, Jacob stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Clara belongs here more than you know," he said. "She's shown more heart in a month than you have in years, Whitaker." His eyes found Clara's, and in them she saw not just support, but love, raw, unspoken, and real. The crowd erupted in debate, voices clashing like river rapids. But as the arguments unfolded, Clara's words took root. A vote was called, and by a narrow margin, the town agreed to share the river's flow, a decision that favored fairness over greed. Thomas stormed out, Margaret trailing him, her face a mask of fury. Clara exhaled, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. The victory wasn't just about water, it was about her place in Willow Creek, earned through courage and conviction. That evening, Jacob found her by the river, the same spot where he'd shown her the garden. The stars glittered above their light, dancing on the water, and the air smelled of earth and possibility. "You changed things today," he said, his voice soft, his hand finding hers. "You made this town better." Clara's heart swelled, but doubt lingered. "What if they never fully accept me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jacob turned to her, his expression earnest. "They will. But even if they don't, I do. I want you here, Clara, with me. Always." The words broke through her last defenses, and tears pricked her eyes. She nodded, her voice catching. "I want that too." He pulled her close, his arms a haven, and as they stood by the river, Clara felt the weight of her past lift. They would marry, she knew, not out of necessity, but love built on respect, shared dreams, and the strength to face any storm. Together, they'd tend the garden, rebuild the bakery, and leave a legacy of fairness in Willow Creek. As the river sang its endless song, Clara knew she'd found her home, not just in the land, but in Jacob's heart. And to anyone watching their story, she'd say, if you love stories of resilience and love that conquer prejudice, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to explore more.